All right. So the first question was one here. It was what are your first thoughts on the actual images?
Well, the images are quite extreme in one sense, but obviously that's the view of that particular artist, and it's almost cultural in that is a type of scene, lifestyle type of magazine that approaches all faiths from a very near the mark basis. And at the end of the day, it's one person's opinion on it may not be the same as somebody else's opinion on it. Somebody might take offence at it, someone else might think it's really funny. But then that's what makes the human race what it is, isn't it? Like, you know, what people see and how people take it. What really should happen though is people shouldn't really take offence at it, because it is meant light-heartedly. And yeah, they've become near the mark. But then you could look at a lot of other things where 10 years ago that wouldn't have been an acceptable way of the press or magazines depicting things. But now, 10 years on, that's quite acceptable. You know, there's more sex on TV, it's more explicit. The things they are allowed to write about in magazines have got much more near the mark, and people will take offence at those. So at the end of the day, yeah, some people will take it offensively, some people will just laugh it off and think, oh, that's quite funny. But you shouldn't take yourself too seriously then.
But what about your personal views, like, as in how would you react to it? Like, would you...
I think you'd have to kind of know the context that it's done in. Very much satire, where they're taking a subject, but they're taking the light-heartedness out of it. Yes, the images may be a little bit near the mark, perhaps sometimes, but that's part of the humour, and it is meant to be humorous, not in a bad way. Well, a lot of the time, if you actually look at the content, there are messages in the content, but there are in everything, aren't there? You know, everything you see, everything that's on the television, advertising, there's always a hidden message. You could take it that at the end of the day, it's your perspective of how you see that image, given your background, as to how far you would think that goes to being near the mark. One person would call it a 10 and think that's offensive. Someone else would think that's a right funny advert. You know?
So do you reckon these artists and designers should have any boundaries of freedom of speech? Like, do you think they have the full right?
Freedom of speech and expression is a very difficult item because different countries have different levels to which they allow people to express themselves freely. And perhaps the English version of freedom and the European version of freedom will be somewhat different to maybe, say, the Russian or the Chinese version of freedom. So you end up with a situation where journalists, anything from the arts, has to express itself. But it has to go over a period of time. It will become more acceptable or less acceptable. And again, that comes back down to maybe your perspective on it, where you stand on that. If you're particularly left-wing or particularly right-wing, it's going to actually be a little bit more offensive or a little bit more jovial. So it's one of those awkward questions where different people will all have different opinions. And yeah, there has to be freedom of press, there has to be freedom of speech. There's been a lot in the news not that long ago about the press and the telephone hacking and things like that. They'd overstep the mark with it, but that's what sells newspapers. So there's got to be a fine line. And it's very difficult that when the line's drawn in the sand as to when you cross it or when you don't. So.
True. Would you have any personal criticism towards the French or any other nations in getting away with such a statement?
The French have very much always been a little bit up themselves, but then there are a lot of countries like that, and again that depends on where you are. The French probably think the English are a little bit aristocratic, but you know, Germany's always had kind of the power, and so people would think the Germans. But you've got to end up with a situation where it shouldn't be about the race, should it? It should be about the world. And at the end of the day, if they're producing that magazine and it's French, that doesn't mean that the French people are bad people. You know, no doubt America, England, everywhere produce stuff that is offensive to somebody. You know, you could take pornography. Some countries are very open with pornography, other countries are absolutely, you know, no way. Well, the world has changed from where it was 10 years ago, what is acceptable now is far, far different from what was acceptable then. And they have to push boundaries. If people don't push boundaries, the world won't evolve.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. How do you think about the situation should have been dealt with both oppositions?
At the end of the day, people are always going to have a positive and a negative on everything. You know, that's what makes the world go round. If everyone had the same thoughts, it's basically communism. The state is telling you what you will think. Yeah. Everyone has their own take on it. So again, what would be offensive to one person wouldn't be to somebody else. So you've got a bit of an awkward situation there where, again, you cross the line, don't you? But where is the line really drawn? And at the end of the day, I suppose you will always offend somebody. You know, you can't please all of the people all of the time. That's impossible. But there has to be a freedom, because if you don't expand those boundaries, we're just going to stand still or go backwards.
So what would your criticisms as such be towards the opposition being the extremist such of their of how they've tacked upon it or dealt with the situation? How they've dealt with it,
I mean, they've dealt with it by basically murdering people. Well, that kind of goes back to a barbarian type of state, isn't it? We don't like what you're doing, so rather than we discuss it or we negotiate, we just kill you. Because basically that was back to the way things were back in the Stone Age kind of thing. So you end up again with a situation there where obviously the people carrying out the extreme act think that's perfectly acceptable, whilst a large majority of the rest of the world would think it isn't acceptable. But there has to be laws and there has to be acceptability. You'll always get people crossing those boundaries. But there's a lot goes on with religion, and there's always been holy wars and religious conflict. And at the end of the day, not everyone's going to get on with each other. But it depends on how that's handled. If you end up with, we all just go around shooting people because they've got the wrong colour shirt on, then, at the end of the day, the world's going to be a sad place to live in. But you can end up with a situation where, in particular, you have a lot of Muslim states that are allegedly associated with Hezbollah, ISIS, etc. But the whole Muslim faith is kind of saying, well, they're extremists, they're not true Muslims, and they go against the Quran and things like that. Again, it's their take, isn't it? One person's read the Quran and believes that what he's doing is right. The other person reads it and believes what they're doing is wrong. Well, you've got a situation again there where unless people talk and negotiate and discuss this through, it's very easy to just go and shoot the guy, isn't it? So they took it upon themselves that the way to stop this was to murder the people, but perhaps they've alienated themselves even more from the majority of people who think, well, that was somewhat extreme to kill the guys just because they're producing these characters, caricatures, newspaper, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes the people actually producing them are not actually the people who are putting over that statement or such. They just work there.
How do you feel about, on the topic of, if anyone was to put a statement of it, or to ask you if any of them were to be blamed, would any of the oppositions to be blamed on, if you were to blame anyone?
Blame is easy to lay on somebody else, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, had they not produced it, had they not been asked to produce it, it wouldn't have been taken the wrong way. The other people wouldn't have taken offence, and you could just go round in a big circle here, couldn't you? If they hadn't been quite so radical, or perhaps quite so strong in their opinion, and not open to other opinions, they would never have killed the guys. But then you could say, if there was retaliation for that, if the French government went out and rounded up a few of the criminals, shall we say, who perpetrated the act and shot them, would that be acceptable? Well, it probably wouldn't. They'd go through a long trial, probably spend a long time in prison, because that's the way the majority of people abide by the law. Anyone can take it into their own hands and go out and kill him. But does that make him right for killing him? In their opinion, it does. But in the majority of people's opinion, It doesn't. It's not acceptable.
In the discussion earlier, we were discussing on what is racism. So would you just...
Racism is something that has probably changed and evolved immensely over many, many, many years. You can go back to the 1800s, the 1700s. There was racism, there was slavery. All of that can be taken as racism. But again, it comes down to extremes, doesn't it? At the end of the day, people living in London now live in a multicultural society. So there are a lot of religions, a lot of ways of life, a lot of lifestyles all mingling together. And it does work like a big melting pot. So you're going to get some good and some bad come from all of that. And you're always going to get some people that are quite apt to accept people and people who are not. And there'll always be good people and bad people in all walks of life. The situation comes when it becomes extreme. What gives them the right to say that that is the right thing to do? If the majority say that isn't the right thing to do, because it goes back again to barbarians, basically, doesn't it? Where, the strongest survive, or the people that are the most violent survive. Well, you could look at that and go into the 60s, it was sort of gang warfare in London almost. Now you've moved into kind of drugs and other things. If you look back in the 60s with the Krays, they only really fought amongst themselves, so it was villains against villains. Nowadays, just because of the colour of your skin or the way you look or the way you dress, you can leave yourself open to abuse or attack as such. So why shouldn't you be able to walk down the street if if you're black, or if you're Chinese, or if you're Muslim, or it's the acceptance. But unfortunately, you'll always get the few ruin it for the majority. And I think that's basically what's kind of happened here, where it's kind of being blamed on the Muslims, but the Muslims in general don't find it acceptable. But is that not what the world is doing? A certain little element finds it acceptable, but a big element doesn't. But unless that element's removed, but then you could question whether the majority are right. So it's one of them real open-ended. People could get very upset about a discussion on that. Other people would take it very much, well, that's what the debate's about, isn't it? You have to talk about it, and people might change their views. If they understood, what this extremist, why he views it that way. But you've got to understand him first. And that's psychology, isn't it, at the end of the day? So,
just to end it off, if you were to give advice to anyone, say, because we're discussing earlier with right wing and left wing, if you were to give any advice to anyone on how they should look at this, look into this topic and the opinion they form, would there be any advice on how you'd get people to look at the situation?
Before you start to make an opinion or form your own opinion, you need to be very well informed, because you've got to see it from both sides, or in this case from many sides. And basically at the end of the day, if people are more tolerant and sat back and thought about it a little bit more, but not only from their own selfish point of view, and had a little bit more thought for other people, perhaps that appears that way to that person. Perhaps we've said it wrong, perhaps we've made it a little bit too near the mark. The whole thing comes down to it that there's good and bad in everybody. So all nations, all religions have their good sides, they have their bad sides. But if we've all got to live together, then there has to be some acceptance. You could go on from religion to like immigration, health service, the whole things that are perhaps at the forefront of the current times with the election coming up. They're very prevalent now. Ask someone in 6 months' time, they probably really don't care. And at the end of the day, it comes down to your personal